An arrogant flight attendant slapped black twins in first class. What their father did next froze the entire airline in stunned silence. An arrogant flight attendant slapped black twins in first class. Thinking no one would challenge him, he didn't realize their father was steps away, ready to turn the entire airline upside down. The moment those hands struck, the cabin froze in anticipation. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. Figures, muttered Brennan Vale under his breath, just loud enough for Darian Korn to hear, as Gel's shoulder barely grazed the corner of the first-class seat while walking past. The word hung in the air like a splinter. Darian paused mid-step. It was subtle, no escalation, no open confrontation, but the undertone was unmistakable. His gaze flicked toward the flight attendant, whose expression was unreadable but whose narrowed eyes lingered too long on the boys. Gel, unaware, had already turned to help his twin brother Kalen stow their books neatly in the seat pocket. The twins moved with a composed rhythm, instinctively coordinated, a kind of disciplined grace that came not from training, but from growing up in the quiet presence of a man like Darian. He adjusted his blazer slightly and sat across the aisle from them, his seat facing theirs directly. His mind noted every detail. He didn't yet know Brennan Vale's name, but his posture, his pacing, and the disapproval stitched into his every movement were already etched into Darian's memory, like a pre-battle formation. Brennan hovered by the galley, arms crossed too tightly, lips pursed. Every so often his glance flicked toward the twins, never with curiosity, never with care. There was a weight behind his stare, not unlike the subtle pressure of turbulence before the plane even leaves the ground. Darian leaned back, eyes scanning the cabin. A businessman 2 rows back, mid-40s, salt at the temples, tailored gray suit, gave the boys a polite nod, then followed their father's gaze toward Brennan. The businessman's brow creased slightly, as if recognizing something was off but not yet certain enough to intervene. The cabin lights dimmed briefly as final boarding procedures continued. Brennan passed again, this time slowing near the twins' row. Kalen adjusted the cuff of his shirt. JL quietly retrieved his reading tablet from his carry-on. There was no noise, no disruption, only presence. And that, Darian thought grimly, seemed to be the real issue. "Feet down, please," Brennan snapped suddenly. Kalen looked up, startled. JL glanced at his brother, confused. Both boys had been seated properly, legs tucked and back straight. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, out of place. Darian's hands rested on his knees, knuckles still. His voice came out smooth and measured, calibrated like a tension wire. "They're seated appropriately," he said without raising his tone. Brennan didn't respond. He moved on, muttering something inaudible as he returned to the galley. But the temperature of the cabin had changed. It wasn't visible, not yet, but it pulsed in the air like a low frequency only a few could hear. Darian's fingers tapped once against the armrest. Not anxious, calculating. He had built logistics systems across every continent for AeroCore systems. His specialty wasn't just how materials moved, it was how bias, perception, and power traveled invisibly through networks. Air traffic patterns, terminal gate design, cargo prioritization. He understood systems because he could hear what others missed. And now he was hearing something, not in engines, in people. Another passenger seated near the bulkhead coughed lightly, glanced up at Brennan, then returned to his newspaper. JL leaned toward his brother and whispered something about Chapter 3 of their mystery book. Kalen nodded, eyes still wary. Darian adjusted his posture. He had once advised a national task force on crisis escalation in air transit zones. He'd written white papers on behavioral drift in uniformed personnel under corporate protection clauses. He knew the signs. What he didn't yet know, what none of the passengers knew, was that this flight wouldn't just transport them to Vantric City. It would unravel a system from the inside, one silent tension at a time. The pilot's voice crackled to life overhead, greeting passengers and forecasting a smooth ride with light tailwinds. Darian listened, but his eyes stayed locked on the aisle, specifically on Brennan, who was now speaking politely to a white passenger 2 rows ahead, offering a drink with a friendly smile. When he reached the twins' row next, the tray remained empty. JL looked up, hopeful. "Excuse me, may I have some water?" Brennan didn't look at him. "I'll get to you when I can," he snapped. "Don't act entitled just because you're in this cabin." The cabin froze. Darian's head turned. Slowly, the tone had shifted from cold to contemptuous. JL recoiled slightly. Kalen's eyes went wide, but he said nothing. Darian stood. There was no theatrics in his movement, no sudden fury, no commanding presence announced. But there was an unmistakable authority in the stillness that followed. Even Brennan, who turned to meet his gaze, took half a step back before catching himself. Darian's voice was controlled. It didn't rise. It didn't need to. "He asked for water, not privilege," he said. Brennan stared at him for a beat too long, then muttered, "Noted," and walked away. The businessman 2 rows back pulled out his phone and started recording discreetly. Darian noticed, gave a near-invisible nod. The observer understood. This wasn't random. This wasn't over. As the cabin resumed a superficial calm, Darian remained standing for a moment longer, his hand lightly resting on the headrest of JL's seat. He looked between his sons, both still composed, both trying not to flinch. He sat back down, but everything had changed. He didn't need turbulence to know this flight was unstable. He could already feel the storm forming, not in the clouds, but in the tension of unchecked authority against unyielding presence. Something told him this wouldn't end with words. "Feet down, please." The voice cut through the hum of boarding chatter like a blade. JL Corin froze mid-shift, the leather sole of his shoe barely brushing the footrest. His posture was straight, his hands folded in his lap, a model of quiet discipline. He glanced up in confusion, his lips parting slightly. Flight attendant Brennan Vale stood rigidly beside their row, arms stiff at his sides, the corners of his mouth set in disapproval. His eyes didn't flicker with concern, only scrutiny, like a guard assessing a breach. JL instinctively dropped his feet further, though he hadn't broken any rule. Kalen, seated beside him, raised his head from his paperback, blinking slowly. "My feet were down," JL said quietly, not in protest, but in confusion. Brennan didn't respond. He stared at JL a moment too long, then slowly turned his gaze to Kalen. "Make sure it stays that way," he said, as though issuing a warning rather than a reminder. Kalen furrowed his brow, holding Brennan's gaze for half a second. The moment stretched, a flicker of challenge in the boy's eyes met with something colder in the attendant's. Darian Corin, seated across the aisle, lifted his head. He hadn't missed the exchange. He had learned long ago how to read the air without staring into the storm. His sons had done nothing to provoke that tone. Yet Brennan's reaction wasn't correction, it was policing. The attendant moved on, greeting the next passenger with an exaggerated smile, leaving attention behind him like a vacuum. Darian's jaw clenched subtly. He didn't speak. Not yet. Moments later, the pre-flight beverage service began. Brennan, now pushing a cart, served passengers with quick efficiency. Aisle 3, then 4, a polite nod, a smile akin cracked open with a practiced flick of the wrist. But when he reached row 5, he barely paused. The twins sat watching. He moved right past them. "Excuse me," JL said politely, lifting a hand. "May I have some water, please?" Brennan's face didn't register surprise, only annoyance. "I'll get to you when I can," he snapped. "Don't act entitled just because you're in this cabin." The sentence landed like a slap in the quiet. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The tone laced each syllable with contempt. JL's hand lowered slowly. Kalen looked at him, then across the aisle at their father. Silence folded around them again. Darian set his book aside. His fingers were steady as he placed one palm on the armrest, the other resting on his knee. He looked across the aisle, meeting Brennan's gaze without blinking. "He asked for water," Darian said, voice even, tone measured. "Not privilege." There was no mistaking the weight in that statement. Brennan stopped, straightened, and for a moment seemed to reconsider his position. He muttered "noted" through tight lips, and moved his cart forward. Around them, passengers turned their heads slightly, pretending not to watch. A few had raised brows, but most dismissed the moment, still seeing Brennan as a professional attending to a busy flight. No rules had been broken, they assumed. No harm done. But Darien knew better. What had just occurred wasn't an accident. It was a test. A warning masked as service. And it wasn't the first. A soft rustle too rose back, caught Darien's attention. He glanced just briefly. A man in his 50s, gray at the temples, holding a phone low against his chest. He wasn't watching a video. He was recording. Subtle. Deliberate. The man caught Darien's eye and gave a slight nod, confirmation. He had seen it too. Darien returned the nod, a gesture of silent alliance. The man's name tag, partially visible under a folded coat, read Kamar. Darien didn't know him, but he recognized the instincts of someone who had witnessed things before and learned to document first, question later. Darien leaned back into his seat, but didn't pick up his book. His thoughts were now fully focused, like a soldier before a breach. The tone Brennan had used, the way he hovered near the boys' row, without any actual service to perform, it wasn't negligence. It was choreography. Kalen glanced sideways at his brother. JL stared straight ahead, shoulders just a little more square than before. There was no fear, but there was tension, one they couldn't name, but had felt before. A sense of being watched not as guests, but as intrusions. From his seat, Darien's mind parsed everything. Not just what had happened, but what it suggested. Brennan Vale didn't skip the twins because he was overwhelmed. He had made a choice, and that choice revealed not just bias, but pattern. A subtle buzz came from a passenger's phone a row ahead. Another message, maybe a forwarded clip, maybe a post. Things were already moving beyond the confines of this aircraft. The timeline had started branching out. Darien adjusted his cuffs. He wouldn't move prematurely. He knew the rules, not just of aviation, but of perception. People didn't believe what they saw. They believed what was repeated, confirmed, and recorded. Brennan didn't know yet that he was being measured not just by protocol, but by lens. The drink cart now clattered further down the aisle. Brennan's voice returned to its neutral tone as he addressed another passenger, his back straight, his hands smooth in motion. But the mask had slipped earlier, and some had seen behind it. Across the aisle, Darien's thoughts sharpened to a single conviction. This isn't about refreshments or conduct, he thought. This is about permission. Who's allowed to sit here without explanation? He glanced at his sons. Kalen had returned to his book, but with less focus. JL was silent, eyes on the seat in front of him, cheek leaning slightly against the window frame. Their silence wasn't passive. It was holding something back. And somewhere deep in Darien's gut, a quiet certainty formed. This wasn't the last strike. It was the opening move. A pressure test. A boundary check. And Brennan had already crossed it. Darien looked toward the front of the cabin, past the curtain dividing first class from the galley. A shadow moved behind it. More attendants. Perhaps more eyes. Perhaps more silence. The aircraft hadn't even left the gate, but the real turbulence had already begun. And Darien knew. Something told him this wouldn't end with words. The slap came so suddenly that even the air in the cabin seemed to freeze. One moment JL was leaning forward, reaching for a napkin with careful precision, his small hand trembling only slightly as he tried to help his brother clean the spilled juice. The next moment Brennan Vale's arm moved in a sharp, unrestrained arc, his palm colliding with JL's cheek with a sound that cracked through the quiet cabin like a fault line splitting. The boy's head snapped to the side, his breath catching in his throat as heat bloomed across his skin. For a second, there was no reaction from anyone, not the passengers, not the crew, as if the entire cabin had been pulled into a vacuum where sound couldn't travel. Then the silence broke. Kalen inhaled sharply, clutching the edge of his seat, his juice-soaked pants forgotten. His wide eyes flicked to his brother's face, searching for a sign of pain, confusion, or fear. JL sat very still, stunned, one hand rising instinctively toward his cheek before stopping halfway, as if afraid touching it might make the moment real. Brennan's expression shifted almost instantly, His brows twitched, his posture stiffened, and his eyes darted around to see who had witnessed what he had just done. He was grabbing, Brennan muttered, voice defensive, breath shallow, as though he could still rewind the last 2 seconds and reshape them into something harmless. His hand hovered awkwardly midair before he slowly lowered it, fingers curling inward. Darien stood before anyone else could move. No sound accompanied the motion, no chair scrape, no rustle, only the quiet, controlled rise of a man who had witnessed far more in life than a single moment of cruelty. His calmness was unsettling, a calmness that carried the weight of someone who understood exactly how dangerous unchecked authority could become. He stepped into the aisle with a steady gait, the overhead lights reflecting faintly off his jacket buttons as he approached his sons. When he reached JL, the boy finally looked up at him, eyes shining with a mixture of surprise and hurt. Darien knelt down, examining the red mark forming on JL's cheek with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence that created it. His voice was low, but every syllable carried intention. "Did he strike you?" he asked. There was no anger in his tone, only clarity, strength, and a stillness that made the question feel heavier. JL swallowed, forcing his voice steady despite the tremble trying to surface. "Yes," he whispered, his nod small but firm. His lashes fluttered, but he didn't cry. He refused to. Brennan stepped forward, voice rising slightly as he tried to regain control. "There was a misunderstanding," he said, forcing a nervous laugh that didn't match the tension in the air. His hands lifted in a defensive gesture, palms outward. He reached suddenly, but Brennan stopped mid-sentence when he noticed the passengers. Phones were rising one by one, lenses pointed directly at him. Mr. Marr, the businessman who had quietly observed earlier, was already recording with his device angled carefully to capture Brennan's face, JL's cheek, and Darien kneeling between them. Another man across the aisle adjusted his seat to get a clearer angle. A teenager, too, rose back, whispered something to his father as he hit record as well. The atmosphere shifted, not loud, not chaotic, but collective. A silent judgment settled over the cabin, and Brennan felt it like a physical weight pressing against his chest. His mouth pressed into a thin line. The apology he'd tried to form faltered. The excuses dried up. Darien rose slowly, the movement deliberate, controlled, the kind of movement that suggested a person deciding between many possible actions and choosing the one with the greatest impact. His expression remained unreadable, not stone, not fury, something far more measured. He stepped closer to Brennan until only a single row of aisle light separated them. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Darien said softly, each word clear enough that even passengers in the far end of the cabin could hear. His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. Power didn't come from volume. It came from certainty. He held Brennan's gaze for a moment longer, then added, "And the cabin hasn't even hit cruise altitude. You're not walking away," Darien said flatly, blocking Brennan Vale's retreat with the quiet authority of someone who had waited long enough. His voice wasn't raised, but the weight behind it silenced the immediate area around them. Passengers who had pretended not to notice the slap moments ago now looked up, sensing that something irreversible had just happened. Brennan faltered mid-step, his jaw tightening, but he straightened his back with forced confidence. "I'm crew authority," Brennan snapped, flashing his badge like it meant something more than fear wrapped in polyester. Darien didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his charcoal jacket and pulled out a small, matte black card holder. A single motion revealed the federal clearance badge inside, the gold and cobalt emblem of the National Aviation Ethics Board catching the light like a flare. A hush spread down the aisle. Even the steady hum of the cabin pressurization seemed to fade. Brennan stopped cold. The color drained from his face in slow motion. "Sir, I didn't realize. You should have realized before raising your hand to a child," Darien cut in, his tone surgical, precise. "This isn't a corporate complaint," he continued, lifting the badge slightly. "This is a direct violation of federal aviation conduct regarding minors and racial profiling in protected cabin zones. The murmurs returned, now louder. Passengers leaned out from rows. One elderly man cleared his throat, staring hard at Brennan. A younger man across the aisle raised his phone again, already recording. The tide had turned. Mr. Marr, the man who had started filming earlier, stood without hesitation. "I'm emailing this to the ethics board now," he said, his voice calm but full of quiet resolve. He held up his phone screen like evidence in court. Brennan tried to gather himself, but the uniform hung awkwardly on him now, like borrowed authority exposed by the truth. He opened his mouth to say something else, but stopped when the flight crew whispered near the galley. Their tones had shifted from defense to panic. The cockpit door hissed open. A male co-pilot stepped out, face pale, clipboard in hand. His eyes flicked to the badge, then to the trembling steward beside him. "Sir," the co-pilot said, nodding to Darien, "we're aware of the situation. We'll be documenting this properly." Darien gave a short nod, but his eyes didn't leave Brennan. Not yet. He turned his back on the steward and knelt beside JL and Kalen. The boys sat upright, their faces pale but composed. JL's cheek was slightly red, the shape of Brennan's slap still fresh. "You're safe now," Darien said softly, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "No one touches you without consequence. Ever." Kalen looked at his father and nodded, the boy's eyes glassy but fierce. JL leaned into his father's hand, breathing deep. Then Darien stood up slowly, the kind of slow that made the moment last, and last long enough for every phone to focus. He turned to the passengers. "This cabin will not move forward until this crew is held accountable." A few gasps followed. One man whispered, "Did he say?" Darien raised his voice slightly, just enough to reach the far end of first class. "We either land this plane, or this airline lands in court." The co-pilot took a step back. Brennan, now visibly sweating, clutched the edge of his seat for support. No one moved to help him. Then Darien said, his eyes fixed on the front of the plane, "Make your decision, Captain. My sons are not collateral for your staff's ego." Darien didn't flinch. Not when Brennan Vale vanished into the galley with panic sweat clinging to his temples, and not when the whispering tide of passenger voices began to roll through the first-class cabin like low thunder. He simply watched as one phone after another remained pointed, watched as the curtain of deference toward airline crew began to tear. Eyes darted to him, some curious, some uncertain, but no one dared approach. They knew something had shifted. Authority had left the flight attendant's name tag, and now sat silently in Darien's stillness. Then came movement. A second figure emerged from behind the galley's service curtain. A man in his mid-40s, with close-cropped hair, spotless shoes, and the face of someone trained to defuse tension without addressing it. His name tag read, Mark Hellren. He wore the polished calm of someone chosen to be the voice of reason when the ship began to list. His smile was thin, professional, practiced, but shallow. "Sir," Mark began, his voice soft like velvet hiding a blade, "I understand emotions are high, but let's keep things calm. We don't want to escalate." Darien turned slightly in his seat, keeping one hand lightly on JL's back. He didn't stand yet. His voice was even, but the steel in it rang through the cabin like an exposed wire. "The escalation already happened," he said without raising his tone. "You're late." Mark blinked just once, but in that single moment, the mask faltered. He shifted awkwardly, then directed his attention toward JL, whose cheek still bore the faint red trace of Brennan's slap. "Do you need medical assistance?" Mark asked, but his voice didn't carry concern. It was the tone of a checklist, a box to tick before the plane could move on. Darien stood now. The quiet around him thickened. "He needs accountability," Darien corrected. Slowly, with full deliberation, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a sealed white envelope. The seal bore a discreet insignia, the Eagle Landscale watermark of the National Aviation Ethics Board. Darien extended it toward Mark without breaking eye contact. "Deliver this to your captain," he said. Mark hesitated. He glanced at the envelope like it was radioactive. "May I ask what this is?" "You may not," Darien replied. "But I'll tell you anyway. It's an emergency arbitration directive. Pre-signed. Trigger ready. Authorizes immediate in-flight crew reassignment or diversion protocol. Passengers didn't understand every word, but they understood the weight of what had just been handed over. Mark took the envelope, his hands suddenly less steady. "One moment," he muttered, retreating up the aisle like a man walking back to deliver a grenade. Darien sat again, but not to rest. He leaned closer to his sons, his voice lower, warmer now, the eye of the storm. "I need you both to stay calm," he said, brushing a thumb gently across JL's hand. "Everything that's about to happen was already in motion before we boarded this plane." Kalen tilted his head. "You mean, you knew something would happen?" "I knew something might," Darien replied. "That's why they sent me." He looked toward the cockpit door, where the co-pilot had just emerged again, reading from a paper with furrowed brows. JL sat straighter. "Then what do we do now?" Darien smiled faintly, though his eyes were solemn. "Now we sit exactly where they don't want us and wait." Whispers grew louder. One passenger angled his laptop to show a streaming platform already displaying a viral tag. #Flight 728. Another man held up his phone. "Customer support lines not even answering anymore," he whispered to his seatmate. Real-time complaints were flooding the airline system, each one a matchstick in a rising blaze. Moments later, the cockpit door clicked shut again. The speaker above them crackled. The captain's voice, unusually tense, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making an unscheduled deviation from our current flight path. This is due to a personnel-related issue requiring procedural clearance. Our estimated arrival time will be updated shortly." Gasps, confused glances, some alarm, some understanding. Darien rose again, facing the passengers directly. "This isn't about weather," he said. "This is about justice." As he sat back down, JL looked at him, blinking hard. Kalen stared at the armrest in front of him like it held answers. Across the aisle, a businessman whispered. He had that envelope ready. He came prepared. Back in the galley, Brennan Vale had heard the announcement. His posture collapsed. Pale and sweating, he stepped out, attempting to speak. His voice trembled with performative remorse. "I misread the situation," Brennan said to the crowd, not to the children. "I didn't intend harm." Darien didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. But when he spoke, it sliced through the cabin like a clean edge. "Intent does not undo impact," he said, "and it doesn't erase proof." Brennan looked at him, then at the rows of phones still recording, now like courtroom eyes. "You slapped a child," said a voice near the rear, flat and clear. "A male passenger, mid-50s. That is neither misreading nor misunderstanding." Brennan's mouth opened, then closed. He stepped back once, twice, disappeared again into the galley. The boys didn't cry. They didn't hide. They sat upright, their dignity now a quiet protest. Their strength turned the narrative on its head. Brennan no longer looked like a man in charge. He looked like a man shrinking beside boys who refused to. As the aircraft began its slow descent toward Eastwarden Aerodrome, the boys finally whispered to one another. "Did we do something wrong?" JL asked, voice small. Kalen didn't hesitate. "No, we just sat where people didn't want us seen." Darien closed his eyes briefly. Even now, the irony pierced deeper than the slap had. But now the whole world's going to see. Due to an onboard personnel matter, the captain's voice echoed through the intercom, calm but clipped, "We'll be diverting to Eastwarden Aerodrome for procedural clearance." The moment the announcement ended, the cabin shifted. Whispers rippled through the rows like wind skimming water. Passengers glanced at one another with puzzled expressions, uncertain whether to be alarmed or merely inconvenienced. One man near the back pulled off his headphones, muttering, "What kind of personnel matter?" A mother clutched her toddler a little tighter. A businessman closed his laptop halfway. Darien Corin rose from his seat deliberately, his hands calm, his shoulders composed, but his presence radiating control. Without raising his voice, he addressed the row ahead of him. "This isn't about weather," he said plainly, his eyes sweeping the cabin with gravity. "This is about justice." A low murmur followed his words, unsure, unsettled. Then movement near the galley. Brennan Vale stepped back into view. He looked like a man who had just realized the cliff he stood on wasn't a ledge, it was a verdict. The color had drained from his face, his posture hunched slightly now, as if the air itself pressed down on him. His hands trembled as he clutched the galley's side panel for support. When he spoke, his voice was brittle and rehearsed. "I misread the situation," Brennan began, eyes flicking not to the injured party, but toward the growing wall of cameras and passengers watching him. "I didn't intend harm." A silence followed, not the kind that waits for an apology, but the kind that decides whether a man's words are even worth weighing. Darien didn't blink. His stare held steady, cutting through the fog of corporate phrasing like a beam of cold clarity. "Intent does not undo impact," he said, "and it doesn't erase proof." That sentence landed hard. Phones tilted in Brennan's direction. Dozens of eyes locked onto him, not as a flight attendant, but as a man who struck a child and now tried to fade into protocol. His breath hitched, as if only now realizing he was being documented from every angle. From halfway down the cabin, a voice rose flat and resolute. "You slapped a child. That is neither misreading nor misunderstanding." The speaker, an older man with a lawyer's cadence, didn't even look up from his phone as he said it. Brennan flinched. His mouth opened, then closed again. The focus shifted. All eyes turned to the boys. JL still held his cheek, not with fragility, but as if holding the memory of the moment, memorizing it so he would never forget, never question whether it truly happened. Kalen sat beside him, chin lifted, gaze forward, his expression unreadable except for one word that pulsed behind his eyes: defiance. Neither child cried. Neither hid. The strength in their silence reshaped the mood of the cabin entirely. No longer was this a case of unruly children or an overburdened crew. It was now, unmistakably, a confrontation between dignity and denial. Brennan looked smaller now, not physically, but in stature. The uniform he wore no longer granted him authority in the passengers' eyes. It was now just fabric on a man who had betrayed what it meant to wear it. Outside, the hum of descent began, the plane banking slightly as it approached Eastwarden. But inside, the gravity of what had transpired only grew heavier. In a soft voice barely audible above the mechanical murmur, JL turned to his brother and whispered, "Did we do something wrong?" Kalen didn't hesitate. "No, we just sat where people didn't want us seen." And that, more than anything, crystallized the injustice. Two boys punished not for disruption, but for visibility. Not for behavior, but for being in a space someone had quietly decided they didn't belong. Darien sat down beside them, placing a steady hand on each of their shoulders. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The moment already spoke for itself. More passengers pulled out their phones, not to film Brennan now, but to film the boys. Some began composing messages. Others posted videos they had quietly recorded since boarding. The plane wasn't just descending, it was broadcasting. A moment captured, archived, and now spreading beyond the cabin walls. And in that closing breath of descent, as the aircraft steadied toward the runway, Kalen leaned slightly closer to his brother and added with a calm, quiet certainty, "But now the whole world's going to see." Upon landing, the moment struck like a silent thunderclap. The jet wheels kissed the tarmac with a jolt, but the real impact wasn't mechanical, it was moral. The cabin, already blanketed in tense stillness, collectively exhaled as the engine slowed. No applause followed the landing. No chatter, just a taut, electric anticipation. Two uniformed federal agents stepped onto the aircraft seconds after the jet bridge connected, their arrival swift and deliberate. One was tall and wiry, the other broader, both dressed in charcoal aviation enforcement suits with silver emblems glinting under the cabin lights. They didn't look around or waste a moment. With practiced ease, they navigated the aisle and stopped directly in front of Darien Corin, who remained seated with Kalen and JL on either side of him. The taller agent nodded once. "We have the footage. We'll take it from here." Darien met his gaze, silent but steady. He didn't need to respond. The acknowledgement was mutual, the kind shared between professionals who understood exactly what was at stake. Brennan Vale had tried to remain hidden near the galley, But the agents turned in unison, leaving no doubt about their next move. The moment Brennan saw them approaching, a visible tremor ran through his shoulders. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. But his face was frozen somewhere between disbelief and dread, a man caught in the instant he realized history had captured his fall in high-definition clarity. They did not place him in handcuffs. The agents simply flanked him, and with a curt nod, began escorting him down the aisle. Phones lifted silently across the cabin like a row of sentinels. Passengers didn't cheer, didn't boo, they documented. Every step Brennan took was filmed with the kind of eerie precision usually reserved for courtroom reenactments. The slap might have started his downfall, but it was the silence that followed, the refusal to apologize, the attempt to shift blame, the indifference to the boys that sealed his fate. As Brennan passed Darien's row, he hesitated for a fraction of a second. His eyes flicked toward JL, whose cheek was still slightly reddened from the impact. JL, though, didn't flinch. Kalen held his brother's hand beneath the armrest, his grip firm. Darien didn't blink. He simply turned his head and watched the man walk past without a word. In the row behind them, a man in a navy blazer, retired Judge Terrace Klein, stood and handed Darien a card. "If you pursue litigation, I'll testify," he said, his voice as sharp as a gavel. His eyes didn't leave Brennan until the latter disappeared behind the galley curtain. Another passenger, a quiet engineer who hadn't spoken all flight, leaned across the aisle and whispered, "I run cloud security for a public streaming service. If you need somewhere to host that footage where it won't disappear, I'll make it happen." He tapped his phone once and nodded. The cabin was no longer just a collection of passengers. It was a courtroom, a gallery, a silent referendum on what had been tolerated for too long. JL's voice broke the quiet. "Why are they all helping now?" His voice was low, not angry, more curious than confused. He looked not at Darien, but at the adults around him, as if trying to understand why justice had waited for visibility. Darien lowered his voice and leaned in slightly, resting a steady hand on JL's shoulder. "People move when silence costs them something," he said. "Right now, silence is expensive." A male ground agent appeared at the front of the cabin, briefcase in one hand and a tablet in the other. He approached Darien with visible deference. "Sir, would you and your family like to disembark first?" Darien stood slowly, but shook his head. "We'll wait." He gestured to the aisle, now forming as passengers gathered their things. "Let them walk through first. Let them carry what they've done." The agent hesitated, but nodded respectfully, retreating to the front. Passengers rose in a ripple of movement, but the usual urgency was absent. No one shoved their bags from overhead bins. No one pushed to the front. Instead, they walked past row 3 in quiet formation, each casting a glance at Darien and the twins. Some looked apologetic, others thoughtful, all respectful. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair paused just long enough to say, "Thank you for how you handled this." Darien nodded once, but didn't speak. As the last of them filed out, a soft calm settled over the space once more. Kalen shifted, his hands still clasping his brother's, and Jell looked up as the overhead lights brightened. In that moment, the boys didn't seem smaller, they seemed larger. Not because of what had happened to them, but because of how they'd stood through it without rage or retreat. Darien remained at their side, not as a shield, but as a mirror, reflecting the dignity he expected the world to see in them. Outside the aircraft, flashing lights danced on the tarmac. Inside, the moment hung like a verdict, final, yet unfinished. The world had seen, but the real story, Darien knew, was only beginning. "Sometimes dignity is the most powerful form of resistance," Darien whispered, "especially when the world's watching." The attendant smirked, confident his position and uniform would protect him, unaware that every passenger, every camera, and every executive clause had already aligned behind a father who doesn't tolerate disrespect. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets force, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The headline hit like a thunderclap before the cabin door of the connecting flight had even sealed. Flight attendant slaps black child midair. Federal investigator was the father. Within 2 hours of landing at Eastbourne Aerodrome, videos from Meridec's Flight 728 had flooded every major platform. TikTok, Stream Vision, Frontgate. The footage varied in angles, but not in content. The slap, the stunned silence, Darien Corin's calm confrontation, and the unmistakable glint of a federal ethics badge. Millions clicked. Thousands commented. A system blinked. Darien watched none of it. While his sons were escorted to a quiet room near the terminal with 2 child advocates from the Aviation Safety Board, he sat in a corner office, sleeves rolled up, laptop open, uploading a secure file. Not footage, not opinion. A 47-page ethics grievance dossier, itemized, time-stamped, sourced. Past complaints against Brennan Vale. Most marked resolved internally. But Darien's analysis revealed something more insidious. None had been properly escalated. Internal memos showed a pattern of minimization. 1. Titled Cabin Conduct Review, Flight 1190. Eerily echoed JL's experience. Raised voice at minor. Physical contact disputed. Recommend verbal reminder. The report was signed and shelved. Now it was evidence. Meanwhile, Brennan Vale's name trended globally. Clips of him retreating into the galley mid-flight, pale and sweaty, became symbols of cowardice and collapse. Still, the airline moved slowly, releasing a statement that called the event regrettable and under investigation. It landed with all the sincerity of an automated delay alert. Darien didn't flinch. He expected it. Systems don't panic until a circuit breaks. At home, his inbox burst. News outlets, advocacy groups, legal teams. They all wanted the story, the footage, the fury. But Darien answered none. He wasn't here for fame. He was here to dismantle the scaffolding that let this happen at all. Instead, he released one measured public statement through the Ethics Board's official channel. Plain white background, black text, no signature photo, no theatrics. This is not about one man losing his temper. It's about a system that lets him keep his job after the first time. No hashtags, no closing flerisc. Just a sentence built like a verdict. And it caught fire. Within an hour, the comment sections began to align. Not with rage, but with recognition. He said the quiet part out loud. The phrase repeated like a drumbeat. On forums, in articles, inside aviation message boards. Some who once dismissed Darien as dramatic were now backtracking. Former passengers on past flights with Brennan came forward. A father whose son had been called disruptive for asking for a second blanket. A university student downgraded mid-flight after an attitude complaint. Their stories weren't identical, but they rhymed. While Darien remained off-camera, his sons were not. With his approval, they sat for a short interview with a local news affiliate. No stage makeup, no stylists. Just 2 12-year-old boys in matching sweaters, their posture neat, their voices calm. When asked how they felt during the flight, Kalen glanced at JL, then said, "We weren't scared. We knew our dad had our back." The anchor smiled awkwardly, caught off guard by the clarity. JL added, "He didn't yell. He didn't fight. He just stood up." That clip alone was shared over 2 million times in 24 hours. Audiences weren't watching for spectacle. They were watching because something about it felt undeniably true. Back in his home office, Darien shut his laptop and let out a slow breath. The incident had passed, but the confrontation had just begun. The airline's legal team, he knew, was scrambling to identify his full background and already regretting underestimating him. A father, yes, but also a systems analyst. A man who didn't just understand oversight policy, he helped write it. A man who didn't merely have footage, he had frameworks. They couldn't offer him hush money. They couldn't threaten him with procedure. He'd already outflanked them. And yet, there was no victory in his voice when he told his colleague over the phone, they'll try to protect their brand by isolating him. But that's the trap. If they make this about one man, they miss that the whole is structural. "Then what do you want them to see?" the voice asked. Darien stared out the window at the planes climbing into the night sky. I want them to see that we're not asking for extra dignity. Just the kind you don't have to earn with silence. That line never made it to the headlines. But something else did. As the video clips racked up millions of views, as the airline scrambled to investigate its own history, and as former passengers began uploading their own encounters, the internet settled on one line. It wasn't long. It didn't shout. He said the quiet part out loud. The internal tribunal began with no delay. Darian Corin sat at the rectangular table with perfect posture, his sons waiting quietly in a separate chamber nearby. Across from him, Brennan Vale looked like a man already halfway to resignation, his face drained, collar loose, eyes darting around the hearing room like there might still be a trapdoor escape. But there wasn't. Not today. The room itself was stark, white acoustic panels lining the walls, recessed lighting that hummed with mechanical indifference, and a digital screen mounted behind the tribunal panel, currently blank. 3 male tribunal members, each wearing dark navy jackets with silver lapel pins denoting federal ethics oversight, sat facing both men. One of them, Chair Laron Davrick, was older, with gray at the temples and a permanent crease in his brow that suggested he'd grown weary of systems that made excuses for men like Brennan. Without preamble, Chair Davrick opened. Mr. Corin, thank you for appearing today. We are in possession of the incident footage, but you've submitted additional material? Darian nodded once, wordlessly opening the reinforced case beside him. He placed 2 thick folders and a data drive on the table, sliding them forward with steady precision. Yes, these documents include the 5-year statistical report I compiled, cabin conduct violations categorized by passenger race, seating class, and incident resolution outcome. Additionally, attached are sealed complaints previously filed against Mr. Vale. Several were internally buried under arbitration clauses. I traced those reports manually through airline policy amendments. He said it all in a low, even tone, the way a surgeon might describe an incision. The screen behind the tribunal blinked on, showing the raw footage of Brennan slapping JL. There was no narration, no commentary, just sound and image. The slap echoed once more in the chamber. Brennan flinched when it played. Darian did not. When the clip ended, silence sat heavy until one panelist, an aviation behavioral analyst named Marcus Tren, leaned forward, looking at the printed graphs in front of him. These show a consistent bias in disciplinary reports for black minors traveling in upper-tier cabins, flagged under vague behavior codes like non-compliant or inattentive. Yet these same passengers registered the lowest actual complaint rates from surrounding travelers. Correct, Darian confirmed. Bias is harder to track when it hides behind vague wording. But the patterns don't lie. Chair Davrick looked at Brennan now. Mr. Vale, do you contest this data? Brennan swallowed, voice barely audible. I didn't mean harm. It was a mistake. Darian didn't look at him. He addressed the panel directly. If the mistake was in judgment, then where's the apology? If it was in action, then why did 4 separate passengers start filming the moment he opened his mouth? This was not confusion. This was pattern recognition by witnesses. They knew what was coming. They just didn't know who it would hit first. Chair Davrick raised a hand toward Brennan. Mr. Vale, your words are not required. The evidence has spoken louder. A soft click of a pen being set down followed, a sound that somehow signaled a turning point. Davrick turned to the other panelists and nodded. We'll move to disciplinary review. Mr. Corin, is there any final recommendation you wish to register before we vote? Darian stood. The room seemed to tilt slightly as he did, not physically, but in weight. He looked out toward the closed door behind which his sons waited. Then back to the tribunal. Yes, recommend what you must. But remember, this case isn't about one man's failure. It's about a system designed to protect the illusion of luxury by selectively deciding who doesn't look the part. My sons didn't need to be loud to be targeted. They just needed to be visible. And someone like Brennan Vale was always ready to interpret presence as provocation. He paused, letting the quiet bite into the air. When a system punishes children for existing in a seat their father paid for, it's not trying to enforce order. It's trying to erase proof that they ever belonged. The vote was conducted digitally and instantly. All three tribunal members pressed their response pads simultaneously. The decision appeared on the wall screen. License status permanently revoked. Meridex Airlines. Federal oversight ordered 24 months. Darien didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply closed his folder, returned the drive to his case, and picked up both documents. Chair Davrick stood with him, offering a quiet nod. Mr. Corin, thank you for bringing the mirror. Darien turned to the panel, voice low but unwavering. If justice must ride coach to stay humble, then let truth fly first class from now on. 3 weeks later, the tremors of Meridex Flight 728 had turned into a full-blown quake across the aviation industry. The footage had not faded. The silence from the airline's leadership had only intensified public scrutiny. And now, across executive boardrooms and regulatory offices, the name Darien Corin was being spoken not as a footnote, but as a reckoning. Darien sat alone at his kitchen table, a single pen resting beside a thick, neatly typed document titled, The Corin Passenger Integrity Accord. He had just signed the last page. His sons were asleep upstairs, but their reflections still lived in every word of the proposal. It wasn't written out of vengeance. It was drafted with surgical precision, outlining a system of principles to govern how minors, especially children of color, should be treated in premium flight zones. Not guidelines. Enforceable standards. Comfort should never come at the cost of dignity, Darien had written in the preamble. He sealed the envelope, labeled it for the National Aviation Ethics Board, and leaned back in his chair. The ripple had begun. Now, the wave would rise. Within a week, the proposal had made it to the desks of federal transportation officials. What shocked everyone was not that Darien had submitted a reform. It was how airtight it was, how preemptively it anticipated every corporate loophole, every plausible deniability clause airlines had used for years. The board passed it almost unanimously. Airlines scrambled. Public pressure surged. Meridex was the first to buckle. 11 others followed. They didn't sign because they believed in the change. They signed because they feared being next. Darien declined every interview request. Networks offered airtime. Journalists camped outside his house. He ignored them all. But when a small aviation university in Calvinport invited him to speak, not as a symbol, but as an educator, he said yes. Not because he won a podium, but because he knew the only way to change the sky was to speak to those who would one day fly it. He brought Kaylin and JL with him. The campus was modest, a 2-building flight academy surrounded by open field and training hangars. The lecture hall was packed, not just with students, but with instructors, retired pilots, even a few reporters posing as guests. Darien Guor no suit. Just a plain charcoal button-down, sleeves rolled. As he stood at the podium, he saw his sons seated in the front row, their posture straight, their faces calm but alert. They were no longer just his reason, they were his evidence. You'll be trained to handle turbulence, Darien began, his voice steady. But what you won't be trained for is the humankind, the kind that doesn't shake the fuselage but shakes the soul. The room fell silent. Children are not threats. Their silence isn't proof of safety. And your title doesn't absolve your tone. He scanned the audience. Some students looked down, embarrassed. Others stared, wide-eyed, recognizing for the first time how power could be misused not with fists, but with stares, exclusions, and unchecked tone. He told them of the flight, not in full detail, but enough for them to understand stakes. He did not name Brennan Vale. He didn't have to. The cabin culture that punished visibility had already been exposed. What defines professionalism isn't how you handle your uniform, Darien continued. It's how you handle someone else's child when no one powerful is watching. Kaylin and JL didn't smile. They listened. They remembered. And as the final words left their father's lips, the applause rose, not a thunderous burst, but a growing rhythm. Respectful, unshaken, purposeful. Darien stepped down from the podium. A few students stood, then more, then all of them. The applause didn't swell, it simply sustained, long enough for the moment to become memory. As they walked out through the back hallway, a young cadet rushed forward. "Sir, Thank you for not yelling, for showing what power looks like when it listens first. Darien nodded, but said nothing. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting a warm orange light across the tarmac behind the university. Kalen looked at JL, then at their father. For a moment, none of them spoke. The sky was quiet, but it no longer felt heavy. And when the applause ended, they were the first to rise. Change isn't always loud, Darien said as they walked out. Sometimes, it's the sound of a door not slamming shut on someone who belongs. The leak hit Meridex like a silent missile. No explosion, just fallout that spread quickly, quietly, and without warning. It came in the form of a brief and signed email to 3 members of the Oversight Committee, time-stamped at 2:13 a.m. It contained a single PDF. Brennan Vale's suppressed psychological evaluation from 2 years prior, marked unsuitable for passenger-facing duties, recommendation, reassign or suspend. Below it, scribbled in a scanned margin, was a note, override approved. Oji Kedon, a senior Meridex executive. The name was familiar to Darien. Craydon had served on the infrastructure board. Darien once briefed. The moment Darien received a blind copy of the leak, he knew this wasn't just about one man's slap. It was a network, and someone on the inside wanted it exposed. Darien sat alone at his desk that night, the glow from his screen casting angular shadows across his face. His thoughts were sharp, mechanical. He didn't allow rage, only logic. Emotion, after all, was what they used to discredit men like him. Instead, he opened his encrypted archive and added the file to the expanding folder labeled Echelon_728. It already contained the footage from the flight, Brennan's previous complaints, and a full behavioral audit of Meridex crew conduct policies by seating class. This document was different. It was proof that the system hadn't just failed, it had chosen to fail. The Transportation Committee convened within 48 hours, the urgency unusual. Darien wasn't summoned as a witness this time, but as an independent systems analyst. He presented the leak calmly, without accusation, and then layered it into a broader presentation. His screen showed data points, thousands of them, each tied to passenger seating, race, age, and incident types. Heat maps emerged, showing that in first-class cabins, black minors were flagged for non-compliance at nearly triple the rate of white minors, despite near-identical behavior metrics. A commissioner interrupted him. "Why the class focus?" he asked, brows furrowed. "Because bias scales with perceived value," Darien replied evenly. The higher the class tier, the more tightly staff are trained to defend the premium experience, even if it means selectively removing discomfort rather than resolving it. There was a heavy silence. "The system isn't biased," Darien continued. "It's calibrated. There's a difference." In the back row, a stenographer momentarily stopped typing. After the session adjourned, word of the data spread like electricity. Darien had expected resistance, and it came fast. Within a week, a formal alliance of airline representatives issued a counterstatement, claiming the Cabin Clear platform, Darien's latest initiative, was statistically compromised and fueled by emotional grievance. But Darien had anticipated that too. Cabin Clear had launched just 31 days earlier, an unassuming site where passengers could anonymously rate in-flight staff conduct based on seat location, flight class, and incident type. What began as a whisper network exploded into a movement. Within weeks, over 100,000 submissions poured in, complete with timestamps, aircraft numbers, and specific behavioral reports. The data was undeniable. Patterns emerged that showed higher misconduct concentration zones in cabins where staff were trained to enforce luxury perception. But now, under fire, Darien released a white paper on the algorithm's architecture, proof that it had been built on defensive modeling principles used in drone calibration, resistant to bias, self-correcting under load, and scrubbed of noise by stochastic verification layers. It was bulletproof. Still, at a press conference, one executive scoffed. "How can we trust a mirror built by a man with an agenda?" Darien's op-ed, published that night, became its own headline. "If your defense is that the mirror is cracked," he wrote, "then perhaps your face wasn't ready to be seen." The quote trended within hours. Major outlets quoted him verbatim. The public, some outraged, others quietly vindicated, latched onto his words like a match on dry timber. Meanwhile, Kalen and JL were invited to speak at a youth aviation summit. Darien had been reluctant at first. They were just 12, and this was never supposed to become their burden. But the boys insisted. Standing before a hall filled with future pilots, engineers, and crew cadets, they did not speak of anger or pain. JL simply said, "We didn't do anything wrong. We just sat in a seat someone thought we didn't belong in." And Kalen added, "We never yelled. But our dad didn't let us stay quiet, either." In the front row, instructors sat straighter. At the back, an older man with Meridex lapel insignia quietly removed his pin. That night, Darien received a message from a staff member at the Oversight Committee. "We believe your data may reshape how training is done across all premium cabins. Would you consult?" He declined. For now. Instead, he returned to his sons, who had just finished answering questions from other students. JL looked tired but proud. "You held the line," Darien said, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. JL smiled faintly. "We just told the truth." Darien nodded, then gazed toward the horizon beyond the summit building, jets blinking in orderly silence, too far to see the tension inside their walls. He thought of all the flights still flying, unaware of what was now shifting beneath them. When a reporter asked the twins later how they had stayed composed through everything, JL replied with the steadiness of someone who had seen far more than his age suggested. "Our dad taught us never to let someone else decide our altitude." Brennan Vale's name resurfaced, this time buried in the third paragraph of a court document. His wrongful termination suit had just been dismissed with prejudice. No appeal, no sympathy, no second act. The courtroom was nearly empty when the decision was handed down. Brennan didn't speak as he left the building, but the finality of the verdict would follow him like an echo in every hallway he ever worked again. Darien Corin didn't celebrate. He wasn't watching the court feed. At that very moment, he sat alone in a windowless operations room, eyes narrowed at a glowing heat map of the aircraft cabin. Cabin Clear's latest interface lit up with data points: yellow for flag interactions, red for crew-initiated escalation zones, green for safe passage corridors. It looked like a cross-section of pressure points in a body being prepared for surgery. Only this body was the airline industry. And Darien wasn't the surgeon, he was the scalpel. The new feature wasn't cosmetic. It was revolutionary. Cabin Clear had just integrated biometric mismatch data, cross-referencing passenger demographics with proximity to cabin structure, lavatories, galleys, exit doors, and crew patrol frequency. The result was unsettling. In over 78% of crew-initiated incidents flagged for misconduct, the passengers involved had been seated near structural boundaries. But when filtered by race, the figure climbed to 91%. Darien's jaw tightened. The system wasn't just reacting. It was targeting. "They're not just profiling by sight," he muttered. "They're prepositioning for conflict." The discovery unnerved him. He sat back, fingers steepled, trying to process the implications. He had designed Cabin Clear to reveal truths, but even he hadn't anticipated this level of silent orchestration. He forwarded the data packet to the Aviation Ethics Subcommittee with a single line attached. "Visibility is a boundary, not a benefit. And it's being weaponized." 2 days later, an email arrived. Subject line: documentary proposal. The cost of Seat 3A. No sender name, just a secure funding source and a brief message. "We'll handle production. You control the narrative." Darien hesitated. He had refused interviews, declined podcasts, avoided news panels. He didn't want to be the face. But this wasn't about him. It was about a system exposed and 2 boys who had unknowingly sparked a storm with their silence. Still, he drew a line. No staged scenes. No dramatizations. Only data, actual footage, and one condition. He wrote back: "I don't appear in it." Weeks later, a discreet team met him in a secure conference room at the East Warden Ethics Center. They brought laptops, storyboards, and a legal liaison. Darien brought flash drives, unfiltered cabin recordings, algorithm maps, crew manifest logs, timestamped transcripts of Brennan's past infractions. The team was stunned at the depth. "This isn't just a documentary," one producer whispered. "It's an indictment in film form." Darien offered them a file labeled Voice Commentary, Final Cut. It was a single audio track he had recorded in the dead of night. No visual, no name, just him speaking plainly, narrating what happened and what it meant. The final line was unscripted, spoken in a near whisper. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He exposed the system by sitting exactly where they didn't want him, in first class, with dignity. The premiere was quiet. No red carpet, no interviews. Just a screen at the National Aviation Reform Summit, a dark auditorium, and a room full of industry officials, whistleblowers, and crew veterans. Midway through the film, a pause came over the audience when a clip played. Brennan's hand striking Jael's, the boy's head turning with a slap, followed by Darien's calm but chilling response. And then came the map, the one that showed where the twins had been seated. Galley adjacent. Emergency row boundary. High crew frequency. The room held its breath. There was the system in red and green, making a decision before anyone ever moved. As the final narration played, no one clapped at first. It wasn't silence of doubt. It was the silence of impact. Then, slowly the applause grew. Not wild, but enduring. Respectful. Necessary. And that line, that single line, spoken like a verdict, echoed long after the credits rolled. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He exposed the system by sitting exactly where they didn't want him, in first class, with dignity. Meridex's new slogan, "Every passenger, every story," glared from a digital ad panel near Gate 47, like a hollow promise dressed in glossy font. Dr. Darien Corn saw at the moment the terminal doors slid open. He didn't flinch. Beside him, his sons Kalen and Jael walked in quiet sync, their footsteps steady, their faces calm. They wore no signs, carried no banners, but their presence spoke louder than any headline. A full year had passed since the incident aboard Flight 728, yet the air in this place still carried the memory like jet fuel residue, invisible but potent. They had come without fanfare. No media, no escorts. Just a father and his sons walking through the terminal that once tried to compress them into silence. The irony was palpable. Meridex had attempted a public rebrand to move past the scandal, but instead, they had made Seat 3 a monument. Passengers now requested it deliberately, not for comfort, but to say, "We remember." Some airlines quietly tried to reassign the seat. Others leaned into it, adding a small placard beside the row, in honor of passenger dignity. Today was not an anniversary in celebration. It was a ritual in presence. They passed by a young flight attendant tidying the check-in counter. He noticed them, paused, and lowered his head in acknowledgement. Not everyone knew their faces, but those who worked in aviation had been briefed, formally or informally, on who Darien Corn was. Not as a threat, but as a reformer who didn't shout, didn't sue for millions, but altered the altitude of accountability across an entire industry. "Gate 9B, Darien said quietly. They turned down the corridor, the light from the tall terminal windows throwing long shadows that stretched behind them like echoes of a moment the world refused to forget. As they neared the original departure gate, JL slowed. His eyes scanned the terminal floor, the rows of chairs, the corner where Brennan Vale had once stood during pre-boarding. There was no plaque, no public marker, just polished tile and a stretch of quiet. But the absence of ceremony made the memory sharper. "Do you think people still remember?" JL asked, his voice low but unafraid. Darien stopped. "Look around," he said, gesturing subtly. At a distance, a man in a gray suit nudged his young son toward the check-in line. The boy, no older than 10, wore a name tag and gripped a boarding pass. When his father caught sight of Darien and the twins, his expression shifted, not in fear, but in recognition. He gave a respectful nod. The son did the same. Kayla noticed something else. "That sign," he said, pointing to a nearby pillar. A poster, not large, not flashy, outlined the Corn Passenger Integrity Accord in fine print. It was titled simply, Passenger safety guidelines, youth protections on board. No credits, no photos, just policy. The tension in the air wasn't hostile, it was reverent, as if the building itself had adjusted its posture. They continued walking. At Gate 9B, a middle-aged gate agent in a Meridex uniform adjusted his collar nervously when he saw them. He didn't speak at first. Then he stepped forward and said, "Dr. Corin, gentlemen." His voice was tight with practiced courtesy. "Would you like to see seat 3A? Darien met his gaze. "No need. We just came to walk through." A pause followed. Then the agent stepped aside, allowing them to pass freely. There were no stares, no whispers, only the weight of acknowledgement. Other passengers around the gate area glanced up, then turned their eyes down, not in shame, but in recognition that this space was no longer neutral. It had a history now, not one etched in scandal, but in resolve. As they passed the boarding lane, Jael touched the side rail gently, right where Brennan Vale had once stood, barring their entry with bias hidden behind protocol. He looked at Kalen, who gave a faint nod. They didn't linger. Past the gate, at the end of the terminal corridor, sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting gold over the tarmac. Darien stood there, hands folded behind his back. His reflection stood alongside his son's, stretched long against the glass. Three silhouettes that once might have been mistaken for trouble by someone too blind to see worth without a uniform. The silence was full, not empty. Kalen broke it with a question. "Why here? Why now?" Darien exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like a final page turning. "Because we don't run from places that try to erase us. We walk through them until they recognize who we've always been." Seconds later, the father acted, stopping the abuse, freezing the crew, and triggering consequences that rippled through the airline. The arrogant attendant realized too late that he had provoked the wrong family. If you believe real authority protects the innocent with precision, power, and decisive action, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, abuse of authority, and the power of standing up for loved ones with courage and dignity. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and justice in all situations.